The hallway on the 14th floor of Hale Enterprises smelled like pine cleaner and recycled air. At 7:30 on a Tuesday evening, most of the offices had gone dark, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the elevator shaft and the quiet, rhythmic drag of a mop across marble tile. Marcus Hale stepped out of the last board meeting of the quarter with his tie loosened and his confidence fully intact. The kind of man who walked through his own building like the whole structure had been constructed around his stride. He had been told once by a magazine editor that he moved like money. He had not disagreed. He turned the corner and stopped. At the far end of the corridor, a woman in gray work clothes moved her mop in slow, deliberate arcs. She did not look up. She did not pause. But she worked the way someone works when they have long since stopped waiting to be noticed. Not because they were defeated, but because the work itself was the whole point. 7 men in expensive suits had just spilled into the hallway behind Marcus, and not one of them had broken her rhythm. She moved around them the way water moves around stone, patient, unhurried, certain. Marcus Hale watched her for longer than he intended. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He had been watching a lot of women lately. That much was true, and he was self-aware enough to acknowledge it without making it into something it wasn't. Since the 3rd anniversary of his wife Elena's death had passed in March without the weight of ceremony it once carried, his closest friends, and in particular his business partner Raymond, had begun nudging him with increasing persistence toward what they called the next chapter. "You deserve someone," Ray had said over whiskey last month. "Not because you're lonely, because you're still young enough to be found." Marcus was 44 years old, and if you believe the features written about him in the regional business press, he was a man who had built everything from a single construction loan and a reputation for never breaking a promise. The truth was something like that, though richer and more particular in the ways that only people who had gone hungry before going wealthy would fully understand. He had grown up in a row house outside Pittsburgh, the son of a mechanic and a school cafeteria manager, and had learned the geography of ambition the hard way, through night courses and 70-hour weeks and a string of calculated risks that had, against all reasonable probability, paid off. When he married Elena Vasquez at 31, it was not a strategic decision. It was the first entirely impractical thing he had ever done, and it turned out to be the best. Elena was a pediatric nurse with a laugh that could change the temperature of a room, and she had loved Marcus in the particular way that steadied people, not softening his edges, but making them worth having. They had a son together, Thomas, who was now 11 years old and possessed his mother's eyes and his father's quiet stubbornness in equal, recognizable measure. Elena died of a sudden brain aneurysm 3 years ago. Thomas had been 8. Marcus had learned, in the months that followed, that grief is not a room you pass through. It is a room that expands around you until the house you thought you knew becomes something unrecognizable. He had survived it because Thomas needed him to. That was the only honest explanation he had ever found, and it was enough. But Raymond was right about one thing. Life had begun tapping him on the shoulder again. And so, in the way that Marcus Hale approached most challenges, with precision, intention, and a certain low-grade stubbornness, he had begun to look. Not desperately, not publicly, but with the deliberate, careful energy of a man who had decided the next chapter was worth writing. And the city of Carver Falls, as it turned out, had noticed. The women of Carver Falls had noticed Marcus Hale for considerably longer than he had been paying attention to any of them. Diane Whitfield was the first. The daughter of the town's oldest real estate family, a 38-year-old divorcee with cheekbones like architecture and the kind of social grace that made difficult rooms feel easy. When Marcus's assistant reached out to see if Diane might be available for dinner, the response came back within the hour. She was available. Enthusiastically. Immediately available. Then Priya Nair, who ran the most celebrated interior design firm in the county and had been photographed at 2 national galas in the past year alone, said yes before the question was fully formed. Then Cassandra Moore. Then Lena Park. Then Rachel Everett. Each one beautiful. Each one accomplished. Each one immediately, but eagerly available. The town of Carver Falls responded the way small cities respond to this kind of entertainment, with the low, pleasurable hum of people who don't often have this quality of material to work with. Who would Marcus Hale choose? The architect turned gallerist? Or the woman from the hotel family on the lake? Was it true he had sent flowers twice to the Whitfield estate? Was Priya Nair wearing a new bracelet at Sunday brunch? The speculation moved through the restaurants and law offices and yoga studios of Carver Falls like warm air, displacing everything ordinary in its path. The women in question performed the delicate choreography of calculated hope with varying degrees of subtlety. Victoria Larsen performed it best. Victoria was, by most measurable accounts, the most striking woman in Carver Falls, and by her own account, which she kept private and never questioned. 36 years old, the owner of a boutique hotel on the lake's east shore, she possessed the kind of beauty that people remembered before they remembered what she had said. Her hair was the color of late autumn. Her manner was impeccable without appearing studied, and she had wanted Marcus Hale's full attention for a long time before he had begun offering it around. When Marcus took her to dinner at the Haverford restaurant in early May, Victoria wore a gown the color of deep water and spoke with the practiced ease of a woman who had prepared every word and memorized every pause without letting any of it show. She said exactly the right things about Thomas, asking how he was adjusting, calling him a wonderful boy based on nothing but strategic instinct. And Marcus had driven home that night, thinking that perhaps this was what moving forward felt like. Smooth. Careful. Considered. He had not yet spoken to the janitor on the 14th floor. That changed on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of June. Mara had worked at Hale Enterprises for 11 months. She had taken the job the same way she took most things in this chapter of her life. Quietly, without ceremony, and with a focus kept firmly on what was directly in front of her. She arrived each afternoon at 5 o'clock, when the offices were still warm with voices and phone calls, and left each evening at 8, when they had mostly gone still. She knew the building the way you know a place you have stopped seeing and started simply moving through. She knew which offices had carpet that trapped dust by the baseboards and which corridors showed footprints by 7. She knew that the 3rd-floor break room always carried the ghost of burned popcorn, and that the executive bathroom on the 14th floor had a soap dispenser that needed refilling every Wednesday without exception. She did not know a great deal about Marcus Hale, and she had not particularly tried to find out. She knew he had a son named Thomas because the boy came to the building sometimes after school and once left a drawing of a brown dog on the break room table, which Mara had moved carefully to the recycling bin, folded, not crumpled. She knew Marcus Hale was generous with the building's cleaning staff at Christmas because the envelope had been substantial and accompanied by a handwritten card that read, and simply, "Thank you for keeping this place dignified." She had read those 6 words twice, folded them back into the envelope, placed it in the pocket of her coat, and returned to her cart. She was mopping the 14th floor corridor on that Tuesday evening in June when she heard the boardroom door open behind her. She did not look up. "Excuse me." The voice was calm and direct, not the voice of a man who expected to be ignored, but not the voice of a man performing authority either. She paused her mop, turned. Marcus Hale stood 6 feet away with his jacket over one arm, looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not condescending, not familiar, something closer to genuinely curious, which was, in her experience, the rarest thing. "I don't think we've been introduced," he said. "No," she agreed, for Marcus Hale. "I know." He waited for her to offer her name in return. She did not. He found himself adjusting his weight slightly, which was not something that happened to him often in his own building. "I'm sorry to interrupt your work," he said. "You're not interrupting," she said. "I'll finish it after you've gone." Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise first, and then something sharper and less comfortable. He had the peculiar sensation of being assessed by someone who had already decided not to be impressed, which was different from someone who was pretending not to be impressed. The difference was subtle, but it was absolutely real. "I've seen you working here," he said. "For months now. I should have introduced myself sooner." She gave a single brief nod, neither agreement nor disagreement. Simply acknowledgement of a fact. "I was wondering," Marcus said. And here was the pause, short but significant. "If you'd be willing to have coffee with me sometime." Mara looked at him for a moment, not through him, not past him, at him, with the direct and uncomplicated attention of someone who sees clearly and says exactly what they mean. "That's kind of you," she said. "But no, thank you." And she turned back to her mop. Marcus Hale stood in the hallway of his own building for 3 full seconds without moving. It was, he would reflect later, perhaps the first time in recent memory that he had been left standing somewhere, anywhere, without knowing what to do next. He walked to the elevator, pressed the call button, waited. From down the corridor came the quiet, even sound of the mop resuming its work. Slow, deliberate arcs across the marble, uninterrupted, so unhurried. He rode the elevator down alone and didn't stop thinking about it until well past midnight. The version that spread through Carver Falls within 48 hours was not entirely accurate, as these things never are. What started as a passing observation from one of the building's security guards, who had watched the exchange from his station at the end of the hall, became, through the reliable alchemy of small-town conversation, something considerably larger than it was. By Thursday morning, the narrative had acquired texture and drama, and at least 2 invented details. The janitor had laughed in his face. She had told him she had better things to do. She had looked straight through him like he was one of the windows she was paid to keep clean. None of that was true, but the essential and verifiable fact beneath the embellishment, that Mara had quietly said no, traveled through the social circles of Carver Falls like a stone dropped in still water. And the rings kept spreading. Victoria Larsen heard it from her hotel manager on Thursday afternoon. She was standing in her office, reviewing a spreadsheet of third-quarter bookings when the information arrived, and she went still in a way that had nothing to do with the numbers on her screen. A janitor, she thought. He approached a janitor. She set her reading glasses down with the careful precision of a person using an object to manage an emotion. She looked out the window at the lake, flat and silver in the June light, and was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to think, and there was something about the story that bothered her in a way she could not yet put a name to. Not the approach itself. Marcus was a man of instinct. She had always known that, and instinct wasn't always tidy. What bothered Victoria was the other half of it. The refusal. Women in Carver Falls did not refuse Marcus Hale. That was simply not a thing that happened, and not because of his money, though the money was real enough. It was because he was the kind of man who made you feel, in the moment of his attention, that being seen by him was its own form of good fortune. And some woman in gray work clothes had looked at that and said no. Plainly, without apparent difficulty. Victoria turned back to her desk, opened her laptop, typed the name into the search bar, the name she had quietly extracted from the building directory through a friend who did payroll for a firm that shared Hale Enterprises' accounting software. Mara Voss. The results were thin. No social media presence, no professional profile, no public records beyond a residential address registered in Carver Falls 18 months ago. It was the kind of digital footprint left by someone who had either lived a very small life or was very deliberately living beneath the surface of the one they used to have. Victoria tapped her fingers once against the desk. Then she typed a second name into the search bar, the name she had found attached to a dormant professional license in the state database. A license that had been suspended 6 years ago under circumstances the public record described only as administrative review pending resolution. The search returned 3 results. One was a brief mention in a regional journal. One was a photograph, and one was a single paragraph in a medical ethics digest that Victoria read 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. She sat back slowly. Well, she thought, isn't that something? Mara did not know she had become a subject of interest. She arrived at the building each afternoon with her laminated ID badge and her sensible shoes, and moved through her work with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized the last 1.5 years of her life in this city. And if 1 or 2 people on the building staff looked at her differently after Tuesday, and she was observant enough to notice that they did, she did not adjust her behavior in response. She had learned, through experiences considerably more consequential than this, that other people's attention was almost never truly about you. It was about what you represented to them, which was an entirely different matter. She went home each evening to a small apartment on Morrow Street, 3rd floor, east-facing windows. It was not a beautiful apartment, but it was hers, which meant more to her now than it once would have. A bookshelf along the east wall held more books than the room probably had room for. Medical texts, structural theory, 2 volumes of poetry that she rarely opened, but never considered removing. On a small desk sat near the window where she spent the quiet hours of her evenings. On that desk, in a plain wooden frame, was a photograph. A woman and a boy, taken somewhere with trees and long, slanted afternoon light. The woman was laughing. The boy had his eyes closed and his face turned up toward something out of frame, sunlight, or a sound, or both. The photograph was 4 years old. Mara looked at it every evening when she came home, for just a moment, before she did anything else, Then she made tea, sat at the desk, and opened the folder she kept beneath the second shelf of books. The folder was thick, dense with papers organized in the way of someone who had once spent years organizing evidence into arguments that needed to hold under pressure. Medical records, letters, some handwritten, some printed. So a faded hospital invoice from 6 years ago, the amount circled in pencil, a small photograph of a child, before and after, the difference between the two images so pronounced that they looked like portraits of different people. Mara did not open it tonight. She simply held it in her lap. She had not done what she had done because she wanted recognition. That had never been part of it. She had done it because it was the right thing, and because, in her experience, right things frequently came without receipts, or acknowledgement, or any form of record that would ever connect the action back to the person who had performed it. But there were nights, and this was one of them, when she wondered if the weight of a secret kept too long begins to reshape the person carrying it, not breaking it, not destroying it, simply changing it, the way a river slowly reshapes stone, patient, inevitable, quiet. She put the folder back beneath the shelf, drank her tea, went to bed. In his house on the hill above the lake, Marcus Hale sat in the study where he did his best thinking and looked at the water for a long time. Thomas was asleep down the hall. The house was quiet in the particular way that large houses go quiet, completely, with the specific quality of too much space and not quite enough people to fill it. He picked up his phone, set it down, picked it up again. He had pulled her file from the employee directory 2 days ago. One line. Mara Voss, cleaning and facilities, employed 11 months. No emergency contact listed. He had looked at that blank line where a name should have been and felt something he could not fully identify. Not pity, not curiosity exactly, but something closer to recognition. The particular feeling of a person who has also, at some point in their life, stood somewhere without a name to call. He looked out at the dark water, down the hill, across the city, on Morrow Street, in an east-facing apartment with too many books and a folder kept carefully out of sight. Mara Voss turned off her bedside lamp and lay in the quiet dark, listening to the city settle around her. Neither of them slept particularly well that night. And whatever was between them, unnamed, unasked, already more complicated than either of them knew, had only just begun. Victoria Larsen did not act on incomplete information. That was, she had always believed, the single discipline that separated her from the kind of people who caused damage and called it passion. She waited. She verified. She built a picture slowly and carefully until every edge was accounted for, and only then did she decide what to do with it. By the second week of July, her picture of Mara Voss was complete. She had pieced it together the way you piece together anything that someone has tried to make difficult to find, by following the edges rather than looking for the center. The suspended professional license had been the first thread. A name attached to it, a license number, a date of suspension, and a state. From there, it had taken 3 days of careful searching across medical board filings, county court records, and one archived article from a regional hospital newsletter that had never been fully scrubbed from the web. Dr. Mara Voss had been, 6 years ago, a specialist in pediatric hematology at Crestfield Children's Hospital in the next state. Not a junior resident, not a mid-level practitioner. A specialist with 12 years of practice and a record that, until the year of her suspension, had been what the newsletter called in the breathless language of institutional pride. Quietly extraordinary. She had published research. She had been invited to conferences. She had been, by every account the public record was willing to offer, the kind of doctor that sick children needed and families remembered for the rest of their lives. Then something had happened. The medical board filing described it only in procedural language. Ethics review, pending investigation, administrative suspension pending resolution. But Victoria had found the thread that led to the rest. A former hospital administrator named Gerald Price, who had been removed from Crestfield in the same year under entirely separate circumstances involving financial mismanagement. A complaint filed under his authority, a suspension that had outlasted the complaint itself because the machinery of institutional review moved in one direction only and did not apologize for the speed at which it moved. By the time Mara Voss had been cleared, and she had been cleared, the final board determination said as much in 3 sparse sentences. She had lost her position, her savings, and according to the divorce filing Victoria found in the county records of a neighboring state, her marriage. Victoria sat with all of this for a full evening before she decided what to do with it. She was not a cruel woman, she told herself. She was a practical one, and the practical reality was this. Marcus Hale was circling a woman who cleaned his floors, and whatever inexplicable quality had caught his attention needed to be addressed before it became something embarrassing. Embarrassing for Marcus, embarrassing for the social fabric of Carver Falls, and most relevant of all, damaging to the very specific future Victoria had been constructing with the patience of an architect who has been working from the same blueprint for years. She did not need to destroy Mara Voss. She simply needed to make the truth visible in the right room, at the right moment, in front of the right people. The Hale Enterprises Summer Charity Gala was scheduled for the last Friday of July. Marcus hosted it every year in the atrium of his building, the same building where Mara mopped the 14th floor every evening. So the guest list included every person of consequence in Carver Falls and several from outside it. The press attended. The photograph circulated for weeks afterward. Victoria picked up her phone and called the one person whose help she needed. She spoke for 6 minutes. When she hung up, she felt the quiet, settled satisfaction of someone who has moved a piece into position on a board and is now simply waiting for the game to proceed. Marcus came back to the 14th floor on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the first conversation. He told himself he had a legitimate reason to be there. A contract review in the records office that happened to share the corridor. He told himself this with the mild self-awareness of a man who knows he is constructing an excuse, but has decided to proceed anyway. He had been constructing a lot of those lately. Mara was at the far end of the hall, changing the liner in one of the waste bins near the emergency stairwell. She heard his footsteps. She always heard footsteps. An old habit from a time when she had needed to be aware of who was moving through a building, and she looked up. "Mr. Hale," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, simply accurate. "Good evening," he said. He slowed his pace. "How are you?" "Fine," she said. "Thank you for asking." He stopped a few feet away. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed. Not uncomfortable, but charged, in the way that silence between two people who are both being careful becomes charged with the weight of the carefulness itself. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him with the same direct, the measuring attention she had given him before. For what? For making you feel like you had to navigate something that should have been simple. Mara was quiet for a moment. She folded the old liner in her hands with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done it thousands of times, her eyes staying on his face. "You didn't make me feel anything complicated," she said. "You asked a question. I answered it. That's all it was. People have been talking about it." "People talk," she said. "That's what they do with other people's lives when their own feel small." She said it without bitterness, as a plain, observable fact, and Marcus found himself momentarily without a response, which was not a condition he was accustomed to. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She waited. "Do you like working here?" The question was not what she'd expected. He could tell that by the slight shift in her expression. Not quite surprise, but the adjustment a person makes when they realize a conversation has moved in a direction they hadn't mapped. "Yes," she said, after a pause. "It's honest work." "Honest work," he repeated. "There's a logic to it," she said. "You do it correctly, and the result is visible and real. Not everything is like that." Marcus looked at her. "What were you doing before this?" he asked. Not demanding, genuinely asking. Something moved behind her eyes. A door opening and closing in less than a second, quick enough that you would have missed it if you were not paying close attention. Marcus was paying close attention. "Something that required more," she said simply. This requires what I have right now. That's enough." She picked up her cart. "Good night, Mr. Hale." He watched her push the cart toward the elevator and thought, not for the first time and with increasing certainty, that this was not a woman who had always mopped floors, and that whatever she had been before this, whatever had brought her to a gray work uniform in his building at 6:30 on a Thursday evening, was a story considerably larger than anything he had yet been told. He went home, had dinner with Thomas, helped with a school project about rivers and erosion, tried, with mixed success, to stop thinking about the way she'd said it's honest work. Thomas Hale had his mother's eyes and his own particular kind of intelligence. The quiet, observational kind that adults consistently underestimated because it did not announce itself. He was 11 years old and had been visiting his father's office building since he was small enough to fall asleep on the couch in the waiting room, and he had his own relationship with the building's geography that was entirely independent of his father's. He knew which elevators were fastest and which vending machine on the 6th floor sometimes dispensed 2 items for the price of 1, if you pressed the button at exactly the right angle. He also knew Mara in the way that children know the people adults forget to introduce, by proximity, observation, and the accumulation of small, unremarkable exchanges that nevertheless leave a mark. He had seen her on the 14th floor a dozen times over the past months. She always nodded at him when he passed, not the performative warmth that some adults aimed at children, the wide eyes and high voices that always felt slightly dishonest, but a real acknowledgement. The kind that said, "I see you. You don't have to perform for me. You can just be here." Thomas appreciated that more than he could have articulated. One Wednesday in mid-July, he came to the building after school while his father was finishing a late call, and he made his way to the 14th floor because the vending machine on 13 had been out of service for a week. He was carrying his school bag over one shoulder and a library book under his arm, a thick volume about structural engineering that his science teacher had recommended, and which Thomas had been quietly devouring for 2 weeks. He came around the corner near the stairwell and did not see the wet floor sign until he was already moving too fast to adjust. His left foot slid. He went down hard, shoulder first into the baseboard, the library book skidding across the marble, his school bag twisting awkwardly beneath him. He sat on the floor for a moment, stunned. His shoulder ached with the specific, deep throb of something that had hit bone, and when he tried to roll it, a sharp, bright pain ran down his left arm. Mara appeared from the supply closet 12 feet away. She had heard the fall, the particular flat crack of it, and she was moving before she had consciously decided to move, her body carrying the memory of 1,000 assessments in corridors just like this one. She crossed to him in 4 steps and crouched down with a steadiness that had nothing improvised in it. "Don't move your arm yet," she said. Her voice was calm, the specific calm of someone who has learned to drain urgency from their tone so it doesn't amplify a patient's fear. "Look at me. Are you dizzy?" "No," Thomas said. He was looking at her with wide eyes, slightly surprised by the authority in her voice. "Good. Tell me where the pain is. Just the sharpest point." He touched his shoulder. She looked, not at the fabric of his shirt, but at the angle of his arm, the way it was resting, the position of his shoulder joint relative to his neck. Her fingers moved to his collarbone, gentle, precise, pressing along the line of it with a sequence that was not random. "Nothing's broken," she said after 3 seconds. "Your shoulder took the impact. It's going to hurt for a few days, but the joint is fine." She looked at his face again. Slow breath. He breathed. The sharpest edge of the pain softened slightly. "You should tell your father," she said. "Not because it's serious. It isn't. Because he'll want to know." She picked up the library book from the floor and looked at the cover before handing it back to him. Something crossed her face. Brief, almost imperceptible. A flicker of recognition, or something deeper. She handed him the book without comment. "Thank you," Thomas said. He was still looking at her. "How did you know nothing was broken just from that?" Mara looked at him for a moment, a beat too long. "Experience," she said. Then she stood, moved back to her cart, and resumed her work. Thomas sat on the floor for another few seconds. Then he got up slowly, held his shoulder, and went to find his father. He told Marcus about the fall. Marcus came up immediately and found Mara still at the end of the corridor. She told him the same things she'd told Thomas. The shoulder was not seriously hurt. Thomas was fine. He should rest it tonight. Marcus looked at her for a moment after she'd finished. Not with suspicion, with something else. The look of a man who has just heard someone describe the anatomy of a shoulder injury with a quiet competence that does not belong to a person who has only ever cleaned buildings. "Thank you," he said. "He's a careful boy," she said. The floor was wet. It was the sign's fault, not his. She went back to work. Marcus walked back to his son, but he did not stop thinking about the way her hands had moved. Deliberate, sequential, and trained, or the way she had looked at the cover of that engineering book before handing it back. He started asking questions the next morning, quietly, carefully, the way he had always approached the things that mattered. Victoria made her approach on a Monday. She came to the building at 4:30 in the afternoon, early enough that the cleaning staff had arrived, but late enough that the executive floors were still busy, which meant no one would remark on her presence in the lobby. She had dressed carefully, business attire, unhurried, the posture of someone with every right to be exactly where she was. She asked the front desk for the facilities supervisor and was directed to a small office on the second floor. She did not go to the facilities supervisor. She went to the service corridor on the second floor and waited. Mara came through the corridor at 4:52, pushing her cart toward the elevator. She stopped when she saw Victoria standing near the wall, with her arms folded and the specific, settled patience of someone who has been waiting and has no intention of pretending otherwise. The two women looked at each other. Mara said nothing. "I won't take much of your time," Victoria said. Her voice was pleasant, measured. "I just thought it would be kinder to speak to you directly, rather than let things play out without warning." "What things?" Mara asked. Victoria tilted her head slightly. "I know who you are," she said. "Dr. Voss?" She let the title land. "I know about Crestfield, the suspension, the board review." She paused. "I know about the anonymous donation." The corridor was very quiet. From somewhere above them came the muffled sound of a phone ringing, unanswered. Mara's face did not change, but her hands, resting on the handle of the cart, went still in the particular way of a person who is using every available resource to remain completely steady. "There are people in this city," Victoria continued, "who will find that story very interesting. A disgraced doctor, working in the building of the man whose family she's been quietly orbiting. It has a particular quality to it, don't you think? The kind of quality that makes people ask questions." She paused. "Uncomfortable questions." "Say what you mean," Mara said quietly. Victoria looked at her with an expression that was almost respectful. "The gala is the 25th. Marcus will be there. The whole city will be there. If you are not inclined to step away from this situation quietly on your own." She left the sentence incomplete, which was more effective than finishing it. Mara looked at her for a long moment, not with fear, not with anger, with the particular sadness of someone who has been underestimated so many times that it has stopped being surprising and started simply being tiring. "I'm not in a situation," Mara said. "I clean this building. That's all I do here." Victoria smiled without warmth. "Then it should be very easy to keep doing it somewhere else." She picked up her bag from the wall and left the corridor the same way she'd entered. Unhurried. Certain. Mara stood still for a full minute after the sound of her footsteps faded. Then she pushed her cart to the elevator and finished her shift. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That evening, on Morrow Street, Mara sat at her desk for a long time without opening the folder or making tea. She looked at the photograph, the woman and the boy, the long afternoon light, the closed eyes turned upward. And she thought about the conversation in the service corridor with the clear, unhurried reasoning of someone who has learned not to think under pressure, but to wait until the pressure passes and then think. Victoria knew about the donation. That was the most significant piece of information. She knew, or believed she knew, enough to make a story out of the pieces, to arrange them in a corridor or an atrium or a newspaper column in a way that would look like something it was not. And she was right, that people would ask questions. Questions Mara could not answer, without answering all of it, without pulling the whole buried thing into light. She opened the folder. She looked at the invoice. The date at the top. November, 6 years ago. The amount. Her entire savings. Every dollar from 12 years of careful work, transferred through a charitable medical fund to a children's hospital. For an experimental treatment for a child she had never met, and whose name she had deliberately not asked for. because if she had known the name, she might have hesitated, and she could not afford to hesitate. The child had been 5 years old. A rare clotting disorder. Without the treatment, then newly approved, a prohibitively expensive, not yet covered by standard insurance. The prognosis had been written in the language doctors use when they are being honest and kind at the same time. She had read the case summary on the fund's request document and had made the decision in under an hour. She had never followed up. She had told herself it was because she didn't need to know. Because the point was the child, not the confirmation. But the real reason, the one she admitted to herself only in the quiet of this apartment, in the small hours of evenings like this one, was that knowing would have made it impossible to carry. She had lost everything the following year. The job, the savings she'd already spent, the marriage that couldn't survive the collapse of everything they'd built. If she had known the name of the child she'd saved, and she would have spent every day of her diminished life measuring what she'd given up against what she'd given away, and that equation would have made her someone other than who she needed to remain. She turned to the last page of the folder. The form was nearly complete. Her license reinstatement application, 18 months of rebuilt evidence, gathered carefully, a piece at a time, in the quiet hours after her shifts. Her former research supervisor had agreed to write a supporting letter. 3 former colleagues had submitted character assessments. The only thing she needed was the final counter-complaint against Gerald Price's original filing, which her former attorney had told her last week was almost ready. Almost. That word had been her companion for a long time. She closed the folder, put it back beneath the second shelf, where Victoria Larsen thought she was holding something that could destroy Mara Voss. And she was not wrong that the information had weight. But she was wrong, fundamentally, completely wrong, about what Mara was. Mara was not a disgraced doctor hiding in a janitor's uniform. She was a doctor who had chosen, deliberately and with full clarity, to be exactly where she needed to be until the moment came to be somewhere else. She had not been hiding from her life. She had been rebuilding it from the ground up with her own hands, on her own terms, in the only way she had ever known how to do anything, honestly. She was not afraid of the truth. She was afraid of what the truth might take from someone else when it arrived. For the gala was 11 days away when Marcus Hale called his assistant into his office and asked him to pull every record associated with a charitable medical fund that had received a significant anonymous donation approximately 6 years ago. A donation that had been processed through the hospital's experimental treatment program and had funded a procedure for a child with a rare coagulation disorder. His assistant looked at him for a moment. "Sir, is this related to—" "Just the records," Marcus said. "Whatever we have." The assistant left. Marcus turned to the window and looked at the city below him, the traffic, the trees just beginning to feel the first suggestion of August's weight, the lake in the far distance glinting like a signal. Thomas had said something to him that morning at breakfast, unprompted, and while eating cereal and reading the last pages of his engineering book. He had said it the way he said most important things, sideways, without ceremony, as if he were talking about something else entirely. The lady on the 14th floor, the one who helped me when I fell, she knew exactly what she was doing, like she'd done it 100 times. He'd turned a page, like she was a doctor or something. Marcus had said nothing. Thomas had said, "Still reading." She looked at my book, The same way you look at something you used to know really well, but haven't touched in a long time. Marcus had put down his coffee. He was still thinking about it now, about a boy's honest, unfiltered observation, and about a folder he had not yet opened, and about a woman on the 14th floor who had said, very simply, "This requires what I have right now." Though somewhere across the city, Victoria Larsen was planning the architecture of a humiliation she believed would be both precise and merciful, because she had convinced herself that merciful was the word for any cruelty delivered with advance warning. And Mara Voss was pushing her cart down a corridor, doing her work with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a person who has decided that if the truth is going to come out, it will come out on its own terms. The gala was 11 days away. Everything was already in motion. The atrium of Hale Enterprises on the night of the gala was almost unrecognizable as the same building where Mara mopped floors every Tuesday evening. Someone had strung warm light through the steel rafters until the whole space glowed like the inside of a lantern. Round tables dressed in white linen filled the ground floor, and servers moved between them with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed. At the far end of the room, a small orchestra played something unhurried and civilized beneath the noise of 200 guests who had dressed carefully and arrived early because this was, by the standards of Carver Falls, the event of the year. Marcus stood near the entrance greeting people with the particular kind of attention that made each person feel, for the 15 seconds of his focus, like the most considered guest in the room. He was good at that. Not performatively, but genuinely. It was one of the things people meant when they said he hadn't changed, which was the highest compliment Carver Falls knew how to offer a wealthy man. In the breast pocket of his jacket was a folded document his assistant had placed on his desk that afternoon. For 4 pages, printed from the Charitable Medical Fund's archived records. His assistant had added a single handwritten note on top. "I think you should read page 3 before tonight." He had read page 3. Then he had sat very still for a long time. He had not yet spoken to Mara. She was working the event, a building-wide requirement for facilities staff, when the atrium was in use. She wore the same gray uniform she wore every evening, which meant she moved through a room of evening gowns and tailored suits, the way a stone sits in a stream, present, immovable, simply occupying a different kind of space than everything around it. She replenished napkin stations. She removed empty glasses from the periphery of the room. She did her work without looking up, which was not avoidance. It was the same focused attention she brought to everything, but which meant she did not notice at first that Victoria Larsen had positioned herself near the east pillar with a glass of champagne and the settled, patient expression of someone who has decided the evening's most important work is already underway. Victoria had spent the gala's first hour identifying the right audience. She was precise about this. She needed people with social weight, not gossips, but the kind of measured, influential figures whose considered concern carried the gravity of a verdict. She chose Dr. Patricia Hale, who sat on the county hospital board. She chose Gerald Mast, who edited the Regional Business Journal. She chose Diane Whitfield, who had been quietly nursing the memory of her own dinner with Marcus all spring, and who would recognize the particular sting of being considered and then set aside. By 9 o'clock, Victoria had them loosely gathered near the east pillar under the pretense of admiring the atrium's renovation, and she began. She did not shout. She did not perform. She simply introduced an interesting piece of information into a conversation between informed adults. "I've been meaning to raise something," she said, setting her champagne down with deliberate care. "Mostly because I think Marcus should be aware of it, and I haven't quite found the right moment." She paused, allowing the group to lean incrementally toward her. "The woman working the napkin station, the one in the gray uniform near the south wall, do any of you know who she is?" No one did. "Her name is Mara Voss," Victoria said. "She's been on the facility staff here for just over a year. Before that, she was a physician, a specialist at Crestfield Children's Hospital." Dr. Patricia Howe's expression sharpened. Gerald Mast set down his glass. "She was suspended 6 years ago under an ethics review," Victoria continued, her voice carrying exactly the weight of measured concern. "The case was complex. I've looked into it. But the fact remains that she lost her license under a formal investigation. And given that Thomas is often in this building, and that Marcus has been—" She paused, choosing the word with the precision of someone choosing a blade. "Paying attention to her, I thought it only right that people who care about this family should know." The group absorbed this. The silence had the quality of something crystallizing. What Victoria did not see, because she was watching the faces of her audience and not the room behind her, was that Marcus Hale had been standing 8 feet away for the last 40 seconds. He had come to find Gerald Mast about a journal piece, and he had stopped walking when he heard the word, Crestfield. He stood very still. "Crestfield," he said. Victoria turned. The composure she had maintained all evening flickered, just once, just briefly, before reassembling. "Marcus," she said. "I was just—" "Crestfield Children's Hospital," he said. His voice was not raised. It was lower than usual, which was more effective. "You said 6 years ago." "Yes," Victoria said, recalibrating. "I was explaining to Patricia that 6 years ago," Marcus said again, as if he were reading something aloud from a document he was holding inside his own mind. "November. A pediatric specialist from Crestfield." The group was very still. Even the orchestra seemed to soften. Marcus reached into his breast pocket and removed the folded document his assistant had given him that afternoon. He unfolded it once, looked at the page his assistant had marked, and read, not loudly, not theatrically, but clearly enough for everyone within 10 feet to hear, a single line. "Anonymous donor, specialty fund allocation. Crestfield Children's Hospital Pediatric Experimental Treatment Program. November, 6 years ago. Total donation, $142,000. Donor occupation at time of transfer, registered physician, pediatric specialty. License number." He looked up. His voice had not changed, but something in his face had. Something deep and structural had shifted, the way a foundation shifts when the weight above it finally settles into alignment. That license number matches the suspended license on the State Board's public record for Mara Voss. No one spoke. "She saved my son's life," Marcus said. 6 years ago, before she ever set foot in this building, before she had any reason to know who I was, she gave away her entire savings to fund the treatment that kept Thomas alive. And then she lost everything. He folded the document. His eyes moved to Victoria's face, and he looked at her with the quiet, even steadiness of a man who does not need to raise his voice to communicate the full weight of what he is thinking. "And you just stood here and used that as a weapon." The east pillar was very quiet. Gerald Mast had taken a small, instinctive step back. Dr. Patricia Howe was looking at the floor. Diane Whitfield had set down her champagne and was looking at nothing at all. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it. The architecture of her evening, so carefully designed, so patiently assembled, had just come apart in the space between two sentences, and there was no version of grace available to her in this moment that would reach the height she needed. She said nothing, because there was, genuinely, nothing to say. Marcus turned away from her and walked across the atrium. Mara was in the service corridor behind the south wall, restocking a napkin cart, when she heard the door open. She looked up. Marcus stood in the doorway. He was still holding the document in one hand. His expression was not the expression of a man who had just won an argument. It was the expression of a man who had just understood something that had been sitting in front of him for 6 years. Something enormous, something irreversible, and who was now standing in its full weight and trying to locate the right words for it. He didn't find them immediately. He stood there for a moment, and the silence in the service corridor was different from all the other silences between them. It was not careful. It was not measured. It was the silence of something that has finally arrived after a very long journey. "You funded Thomas's treatment," he said. Not a question. The statement of a man reading a truth he has confirmed from every available angle. Mara looked at him. She had heard enough of the conversation through the thin atrium wall to understand what had happened. Her expression was not triumphant. It was not even particularly relieved. It was the expression of someone who has carried something for so long that the putting down of it produces a kind of ache all its own. The ache of muscles adjusting to the absence of weight they had learned to hold. "I didn't know it was your son," she said quietly. "I never asked for names. I just knew a child was going to die without the treatment, and that I had the means to prevent it." Marcus looked at her. "You lost everything after." "Yes. Your practice, your savings, He stopped. "Yes," she said again. He unfolded the document one more time and looked at the page, even though he already knew what it said. The gesture of a man who needs to confirm with his eyes what he already understands in his chest. "I've had the hospital's letter for 6 years," he said. "The one that said an anonymous donor had come forward. I kept it in my desk at home. I looked at it. I can't tell you how many times." He paused. "I never stopped wondering who it was." Mara was quiet. Her hands rested at her sides, still. "Thomas is 11 years old," Marcus said. "He's the best thing I've ever been part of. And the only reason he is here." His voice broke, not dramatically, not in the way of a man performing a motion, but in the way of a man who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and has just been given permission to let go of it. "Is because of you." He crossed the corridor and stood in front of her. And then Marcus Hale, one who had built a company from nothing and stood in boardrooms that smelled like money and moved, by all accounts, like the most confident man in any room. He took her hand in both of his, the way you take the hand of someone to whom you owe a debt that does not have a currency, and he simply held it. Mara looked down at his hands, then up at his face, and for the first time since Victoria had introduced that word, Crestfield, into the evening's conversation, something in her exhaled. Not tears, not yet. Something quieter than tears. The long, slow release of a breath held for 6 years. "I didn't do it for recognition," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the whole point." The service corridor was lit by a single fluorescent bar and smelled like clean linen and pine. Outside, through the thin wall, The orchestra played something soft, and the voices of 200 guests rose and fell in the easy warmth of people who didn't yet know what had just happened. And in here, in the narrow and unglamorous space behind the south wall, something that had been buried for 6 years finally came entirely into the light. The door opened once more, and Thomas stood in it. He had been waiting in the small staff room on the second floor, as he often did when his father hosted late events, reading his engineering book with the focused patience of a boy who has learned that important things happen on adult schedules. But he had grown bored, and he had come looking for his father, and the building's east stairwell had brought him to this corridor at this precise moment. He looked at his father. He looked at Mara. He looked at his father's hands holding Mara's hand. He was 11 years old, and he was not a child who required lengthy explanations. He looked at Mara's face for a long moment with his mother's eyes, direct, clear, entirely without pretense. "You're the one who helped me when I fell," he said. "Yes," Mara said. Thomas nodded slowly. He looked at the document in his father's other hand. He had seen documents like that before, the kind adults held when something important was being resolved. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked. Not to his father. To Mara. And Mara looked at this boy, this 11-year-old boy who stood in the corridor with his engineering book under his arm, and his mother's eyes, and his father's particular brand of quiet attention. And she understood. In the full and complete way you understand something only when it arrives in front of you in the shape of a living person, that the answer to the question she had been carrying for 6 years was standing 3 feet away. It had always been worth it. It was worth it now. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. "I think I am." The gala ended at 11. The guests left. The orchestra packed their instruments. The atrium was restored to the still, cathedral silence of a large building after an event. Chairs in neat rows, glasses collected, the warm lights beginning to be switched off from the far end inward until only the front entrance remained lit. Victoria Larsen left at 9:30 before the formal close. She moved through the remaining guests with her shoulders set and her chin level, because she was not a woman who permitted her posture to tell her story, but the room had heard what it had heard. Gerald Mast had already spoken quietly to 3 people he trusted. Dr. Patricia Hale had asked for Mara's information from the facilities desk before she left, leaving her own card with a note written on the back. And the particular social gravity that had arranged itself around Victoria for years, the deference, the inclination, had shifted in its orbit in the subtle but irreversible way of things that cannot be unshifted. She did not disappear from Carver Falls. She was not ruined or demolished. She simply became, over the following months, someone the city regarded with the careful distance it reserves for people who have been witnessed at their worst and who have not offered anything adequate in response. The boutique hotel continued to operate. She continued to attend events. But the rooms she entered no longer rearranged themselves around her arrival, and she felt that absence every day like a splinter she could not reach. The counter-complaint against Gerald Price's original ethics filing was resolved in the 3rd week of August. Marcus's legal team, the same people who negotiated 9-figure contracts and had never lost a case they chose to take, had provided, without being asked for payment and without requiring a reason, 3 pieces of documentary evidence that had been missing from Mara's original reinstatement application. The State Medical Board reviewed the complete file and issued its determination in language that was formal and dry. And, to Mara, the most beautiful thing she had read in 6 years. Her license was reinstated. Full standing. No conditions. Dr. Patricia Hale, who sat on the county hospital board and who had gone home from the gala and read every document she could find about Mara Voss's case before going to sleep, called on a Wednesday morning and asked if Mara would be willing to come in for a conversation. Not an interview, a conversation. There was a part-time consulting position in the pediatric unit that had gone unfilled for 4 months, if Mara was interested. Mara was interested. She gave her notice to the facilities manager at Hale Enterprises on a Thursday afternoon. 2 weeks' notice, full term, because that was who she was. The facilities manager shook her hand and said she was the most reliable person he had ever managed, and that he was sorry to lose her, and that he hoped whatever she was going to next was worthy of her. She thanked him, which was the only response she had for things that moved her deeply. She cleaned the 14th floor one last time on her final shift. She did it with the same slow, deliberate arcs she had used for 11 months. The building was quiet, the offices dark, the marble cool under the pine-scented cleaner. She did not rush. She did the work the way she had always done the work, fully, completely, as if it were worth doing. Because that had been true when she arrived, and it was still true now, and the change in her circumstances did not alter the value of the thing itself. When she finished, she rode the elevator down and walked to her car in the quiet of the evening lot. Marcus was leaning against her car. He had sent her a message an hour earlier. "I'll be in the lot when you finish. No obligation. I just wanted to say goodbye to the building's best employee properly." She had not replied, but she had known she would find him there. They stood in the parking lot in the warm August dark, the city spread out below the hill in its ordinary, glittering way. "Thomas wants to know if you'll help him with his engineering project," Marcus said. "Something about load-bearing calculations for a bridge he's designing. He says you're the only person he knows who understands both the medical and the structural components of..." He stopped. "I don't fully understand the project, to be honest." Mara smiled. It was, for the people who had known her in this chapter of her life, one of the first times they had seen it fully. Not the small, controlled expression she allowed herself in corridors and service rooms, but something unreserved and real. It changed her face the way sunlight changes a room. "Tell him yes," she said. Marcus nodded. He looked at her for a moment. The direct, honest look of a man who has stopped being careful in the presence of someone who doesn't require it. "What I said in the corridor," he said, "about wondering for 6 years. I meant it." "I know you did," she said. "I'd like to keep knowing you," he said, "outside of this building, without a mop between us. Just as a person, if that's something you'd consider." Mara looked at him. The parking lot was very quiet. From somewhere near the building's entrance came the sound of the security guard doing his last round. Footsteps on stone, steady and unhurried, the sound of a building settling into its own end of day. "I'll consider it," she said. It was not a yes. He understood that. But it was the beginning of one, which is the only kind that means anything when it finally comes. On the desk in the apartment on Morrow Street, the folder that had lived beneath the second shelf of books for 18 months was gone. In its place, Mara had set 2 things: the plain wooden frame with its photograph, the woman and the boy in the long afternoon light, which she now kept not as a reminder of what she'd sacrificed, but as a record of what had mattered. And a single piece of paper. Official letterhead, a license number, Her name, printed at the top in the clean, declarative font of a document that does not apologize for what it is. She had looked at it for a long time the evening it arrived, not with the relief of someone who has been vindicated. Vindication had never been the point, but with the quiet, the grounded satisfaction of someone who had always known who they were, even through the years when the official record said otherwise, and who now simply had the paper to match. She started at the hospital the following Monday. She wore different clothes. Thomas stopped by her office 3 weeks later, with his bridge schematics under his arm, and a list of questions that took an hour and a half to work through. He sat across from her at the desk, with the same focused attention he brought to everything important. And when they were finished, he packed up his papers and looked at her with his mother's eyes and said in the offhand, conclusive way of a boy who has made a decision and does not feel the need to dramatize it, "I'm glad you're here." She looked at him across the desk. "So am I," she said, and that was the whole of it. The whole enormous, quiet, hard-earned truth of it, contained in 8 words between a boy and a woman in a small office on a Monday afternoon in September, with the city carrying on outside the window and the light coming in at a long, warm angle, the way it comes in when the summer is almost over and the best part of the year is still ahead. There are people who do extraordinary things and spend their lives invisible because the thing they did required the kind of sacrifice that doesn't survive being made public. They don't look for gratitude. They don't perform their goodness. They simply carry it, quietly, the way you carry anything that belongs to you. Mara Voss spent 6 years in the particular shadow that falls on people when institutions fail them and circumstances take everything and the world moves on without ceremony or apology. She did not become bitter. She did not stop being who she was. She built her way back with patience and honesty and the kind of daily dignity that doesn't require an audience, because it was never about the audience. And when the truth finally came into the light, not because she pushed it there, but because it found its own way, it did not come with fanfare. It came with a folded document in a service corridor, and a boy in a doorway asking if she was going to be okay, and a man in a parking lot asking, plainly and without performance, if she would consider letting him know her. The truth always finds its way to the surface, not always on schedule, not always through the door you expect, but always, always, in the end. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.